We have created an economy that has become too big for our planet. Many of our landscapes and the supply chains that they depend upon are collapsing. We saw 3 years ago, cocoa production globally collapse. Last year, coffee production collapsed. In the last 5 years, we have seen more than 15 food supply chains collapsing around the world due to the combined effects of land degradation and climate change. No biodiversity, no life, no economy. So it's as simple as that.
This is Wild by Nature, stories of human connection to the wild. This is a podcast exploring how nature, ancient wisdom and lived experience guide us back to purpose, balance and belonging. I'm your host, Vian Sharif, and if you've ever felt the pull to slow down, reconnect and listen more closely to the world around you, you're in the right place. Hello and welcome to Wild by Nature. We all know what it feels like when we're immersed in nature, when we're connected to nature, and what that feels like to us. But what happens when that sense of connection makes its way into our business lives, our corporate lives, or even the world of investing? Today's guest is Marc Palahí. He's Chief Executive of the Circular Bioeconomy Alliance and also Chief Nature Officer at Lombard Odier, which is a Swiss private bank and asset manager. Marc, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Vian, for the invitation. A pleasure to be with you today.
It's always a pleasure to be with you, Marc, and to learn more about your work and your journey. And perhaps I could start by asking you, you have dedicated your life to nature, first in science, and now taking that through not only into your work in banking and finance, but also into the work of the circular bioeconomy, which is both really transformational projects. Mm-hmm. But was there a moment where nature connected with you and you just knew that this was going to be your path?
That was a long time ago. That was when I was a kid, because I used to spend my summers in the Pyrenees. I have my aunt and my uncle. They live in the middle of the Pyrenees. So since I was 7, 8 years old, I used to spend the whole summer there, contribute to the family work, which was related to agriculture, to forestry, very much in the middle of the mountains. And, every summer I was thinking the same. When it was time to go back to Barcelona, where I was coming from, I thought, I hope that one day I don't need to go back and I can find a job that connects me to nature, because I was feeling the freedom of being in nature, connected, it was a very nice feeling. And afterwards, when I had the opportunity to choose my university studies, first I decided to study agronomy. Then I moved to forest science, and I went to Finland. And finally, I conducted a PhD on forest ecology and economics.
Wow. So very early on, you knew you wanted to be surrounded by nature. Yeah. And it was that landscape that you were operating in at a very early age that made you feel that way.
Yes.
What was it about academic life, being a scientist, that what did you take from that?
Well, it was very important for me because first in my university studies and especially my doctoral studies, my ambition was to learn as much as possible, to get the inspiration from nature, to understand how nature operates, how natural ecosystems operate, because I felt that it was a great divergence between how our world, the world that we have created, operates, our economy, and how natural ecosystems function. Cycles are different, principles are different, change time frames and scales, scales at geographical scale are very different. And I was always very curious why these divergences exist. So that my first, part or phase in my career was about understanding this scientific component, and then when I learned enough, I decided to jump into how do we translate that knowledge into action to change our current economic system, which is not in synchronicity with our natural ecosystems.
Marc, can you tell us a little bit more about this divergence that you became aware of? I think many of us sense that there's a divergence somewhere within ourselves, but we haven't managed to actually study or become aware of what they are. Tell us more about that.
It is a big divergence. And just remember one thing, for the last 200 years, our economy has been operating by an extractive economy powered by fossil resources. So we have developed a sort of a mining mindset. We extract resources. It's a linear economy, a wasteful economy. And fossil resources are opposed to biological resources, which are living resources. Fossil means death in a way. Biological resources, bio means life. So the problem is that we have created an economy that has become too big for our planet. It has transcended our planetary boundaries. We have created an economy that generates a lot of environmental externalities in the form of climate change, biodiversity loss, natural ecosystems degradation, pollution. And after doing that for 200 years, now we have crossed the so-called planetary boundaries, which sounds a bit abstract concept, but to make it simple, basically it means that when you cross the planetary boundaries, our planet, our environment, cannot absorb any longer all these externalities and risks that we are generating with our economic activities, which means in turn that all these different risk externalities are coming back to us, and it's our economy that needs to absorb them. And this is what we are seeing today. If you look at the global insured losses due to climate change and nature degradation, they have doubled in the last 10 years compared to the previous 10 years. We are seeing how different supply chains across different industries are collapsing because of the compounding effects of climate change and nature degradation. So in a way, ecosystem risks have reached a tipping point, and now it means that these ecosystem risks are being internalized into economic risks. Basically because our economy doesn't operate within the ecological boundaries of the planet. We have transgressed those planetary boundaries.
And Marc, this is an interesting theme because, as you say, we're all very used to, certainly in the Western world, this concept of linear growth, and it's just going to continue to get better and better and better, as in economics, as in the way that we operate and operate in our own lives. So, for example, if we look at some Eastern traditions, actually what we're looking at is a cyclical model where you actually don't want too much that's out of balance anywhere. You want to be quite happy at times, and you want to understand that there are going to be times when, you're going to be moderately okay, and that's a cycle. You don't want too much of anything. You want it to be in balance. And so if we think about it from that perspective, how does one think about a different system, which is not so linear, but which is instead perhaps circular?
Exactly. And this is what some of us call the circular bioeconomy. Bio meaning life, is a circular economy powered by life, rooted in nature. An economy that understands, values, and invests in nature as what it is, the most important capital that we have, the basis for our economy. So, and I think this is what we need to transition towards, is an economy that prospers within the ecological boundaries of our planet. Basically, we need to adjust our economy to the ecology of the planet. And funnily enough, economy and ecology, they come from the same word, oikos. It's a Greek word that is coming from oikos, which means our home, our environment. So economy, the nomos, is managing. So economy means managing our environment, our home. Ecology, logos, is understanding, means understanding our home or our environment. You cannot manage what you don't understand. So you see, we need an economy that follows ecology, because our economy is embedded in our planet. So it needs to prosper within the ecological boundaries. And I think this is what we need to adjust. And as you mentioned before, the problem is in the Western world, we have been very good at translating knowledge into technology. We are obsessed with technology. We create technology to solve problems that we are creating ourselves. And I think we need to move one step forward and translate knowledge into wisdom. And this is where many indigenous people are very good at, in translating knowledge into wisdom Because without wisdom, you can develop a lot of technologies, but if you continue creating problems, you just try to cope with the problems that you are creating with that technology.
I think this takes us into an interesting area, which is two pieces around wisdom. One is the wisdom of those communities who have lived alongside nature for thousands and thousands of years and have observed it, and also the nature itself, where you have an intelligence that we're in many places just scratching the surface of. We don't understand how migratory patterns of butterflies work when they are traveling across continents, across multiple generations of butterflies and returning to exactly the same spots thousands and thousands of years, year on year. We don't understand how networks of tree roots underground communicate with each other to communicate risk. There's so much we don't understand. What are your thoughts on this area, natural intelligence, wisdom, and so on?
This is very interesting because, of course, we need to differentiate between two things because sometimes we are confused. Nature is complex, but it's not complicated. The paradigm that we have been using for the last 400 years, which comes from the scientific revolution, the Cartesian paradigm, has been very good at trying to interpret the world as a complicated machine, where you understand the whole by analyzing. It's a reductionist approach. You analyze the different parts and then you think that you can understand the whole. But the planet doesn't work like this. That works for a machine. When you want to understand a car, if you divide the pieces, you will understand. But nature is complex. Everything is interconnected, interdependent, interrelated. So the whole is always greater than the parts. And this is where, with our Western paradigm, we are failing to understand the complexity of nature. In nature, the only thing permanent is change, evolution. In nature, the most important principle is the principle of biodiversity, unity in diversity. Biodiversity is the insurance of life to adapt and evolve in a constant changing environment. And nature doesn't follow a principle of efficiency like our economy does. It follows a principle of resilience. Because everything is all the time changing, what you need to ensure is that your systems are resilient, adaptable to change. And I think these type of principles are the principles that now our economy needs to adopt.
And interestingly, this is a word that we are starting to hear more and more in investments. And can you help us understand, help our listeners understand how this concept of resilience is playing out in what's happening to companies and what's happening to the production of our food, for example?
Yeah, very good example. Now we are reaching a tipping point. And the food systems is a very clear one. A tipping point due to the combined effects of climate change and nature degradation. Climate change, the problem with climate change is not the steady global warming. It's the fact that extreme events are becoming more frequent and intense than ever. Droughts, floods, heat wave. These are coming more often. On the other side, because we have degraded our landscapes, because we have used extractive approaches, fossil inputs, pollution, we have lost a lot of biodiversity. Our landscapes are not any longer adaptable or resilient to change in a moment where these changes are becoming more frequent and intense than ever. The result that we are seeing is that many of our landscapes and the supply chains that they depend upon are collapsing. We saw 3 years ago, cocoa production globally collapse. Last year, coffee production collapsed. In the last 5 years, we have seen more than 15 food supply chains collapsing around the world due to the combined effects of land degradation and climate change. And this is because we have not built enough resilience in our economy, because we have prioritized efficiency. Basically, what we have done in the last 50 years we have simplified our landscapes through monocultures, extractive approaches, and complexify our supply chains. A lot of intermediaries obtaining margins and avoiding that capital flows upstream, where the custodians of our landscapes, indigenous people, farmers, should have enough resources to build a resilience. So now, because we have reached this tipping point and many of our supply chains are collapsing, we need to reverse the situation. we need to complexify our landscapes and simplify our supply chains. Complexify landscapes by enriching biodiversity, building resilient landscapes, which can absorb these shocks. When you build resilience, you can create the conditions for absorbing these shocks, and simplify the supply chains, bring them closer to the final consumer, and also cutting intermediaries so that then you have enough margins to flow upstream, where investment should go in the funds of nature-based solutions. So I think this is the system-level transformation that we need. We need to invest in our natural capital, which is underpinning our economic activities.
When we think of nature in this way, it sounds to me like it's another part of the infrastructure that we require to actually function. Would you agree with that concept?
No, I would say that is the keystone infrastructure regulating our planetary system, including our climate, but including all our economic activities, because it regulates the food we eat, the water we drink, the air we breathe. So you could say that is the underpinning infrastructure for all our economic activities to function. The problem is that our economic system has operated in the last decades deriving value from price rather than price from value. And I think this is a paradigm shift that we need in our economy. We need to recognize and value nature as what it is, the underpinning infrastructure for any economic activity. So a degraded landscape is a liability, a regenerative landscape is an asset.
Mm-hmm. And what happens if we don't do this? What will happen, do you think?
Well, it's happening already. If you look, for example, the last European Investment Bank report last summer, it estimated that the European agricultural sector, we are talking about European agricultural sector is losing nowadays 28 billion per year due to the impacts of weather extreme events in combination with land degradation. And they estimated, and I think it's an underestimation, those losses will double in the next 20 years. So it's already happening. The fact these ecosystem risks are being translated into economic risks as we speak. And this translation is accelerating every year. Because, something that we don't understand, and you mentioned before, is that nature as a complex system has non-linear patterns and processes. And this is the challenge of understanding tipping points. Once you reach a tipping point, for instance, climate change accelerates biodiversity loss, but biodiversity loss accelerates climate change. We can see that very clearly in forests. The more climate change, the more wildfires, droughts that will destroy many of our forests, which are the main terrestrial carbon sink we have. When you destroy forests, like nature, is made out of carbon. You release huge amounts of carbon that accelerate again climate change, more wildfires, more destruction in terms of forest loss, more carbon to the atmosphere. So you enter into a vicious cycle that starts accelerating. The good news is that also you can reverse that, and then you start creating virtuous cycle. Once you start regenerating nature with the right principles, the right approaches, you start restoring biodiversity. Therefore, you start also enhancing the carbon sinks, and nature delivers. If you treat nature well and you understand the principles, it will deliver back to you. It's a matter of adjusting our economy to these natural processes.
What do you think your scientific studies, where you really devoted your time to understanding these relationships within nature and how the systems level work, what do you think that's brought to your work today?
Well, one of the first things you learn when you are conducting scientific studies in nature is the importance of biodiversity. Biodiversity is the fabric of life. It's a prerequisite for any natural system to function, adapt, and evolve in this changing environment.
So you're saying that if we don't have biodiversity, we cannot function, adapt, or evolve?
Exactly. No biodiversity, no life, no economy. So it's as simple as that. So biodiversity is the driver, is the engine of life in our planet. You understand that very, very easily. And also you understand in nature as a complex system that is very much about virtuous cycles or vicious cycles. They are not linear systems, or they operate in a regenerative way, and that requires building through the right principles, so that the nature works with adequate infrastructure, or otherwise you enter into vicious cycle. When you start losing biodiversity, you are losing resilience in the system, and then any shock, and now we have more shocks than ever, can start degrading, accelerating this degradation, and you enter into a vicious cycle. So it's very much about understanding these patterns and these flows. As you mentioned before, it's very much also in connection to this paradigm of Eastern philosophies that sees everything as a flow of energy and patterns. This is how nature operates. In nature, as I mentioned before, is a constant flow of energy, from sunlight to life. The most pure form of energy is sunlight. The most complex form of energy is life.
Tell us a bit more about how forests actually do operate.
Well, forests are fantastic. And if we are here today, it's because forests, 400 million years ago, when they emerged, they transformed the planet. Before forests emerged in our planet, the climate was 10 degrees warmer than it is today. And the CO2 concentration was 10 times what it is today. But you see, forests operate following ecologies of scale. Basically, what they do is fascinating infrastructure or technology. Technology, because remember that technology, technes and logos means the skills of understanding. So forests, what they do is they transform solar energy, water and CO2 into renewable biochemical energy. And they do that while releasing oxygen that we breathe and recirculating water in vapor format. So basically, forests are the interface between us and the sun, because they translate that energy of the sun into biochemical energy and matter that we can utilize in form of biomass, in terms of fluxes and processes. So basically nowadays, for example, the furniture we have around is made of wood. This is made with solar energy. And basically trees are capturing CO2, which nowadays is a problem. And they transform this CO2 into biochemical energy that we can utilize in our economy.
So forests are the foundation of life.
Yes.
Interesting.
Of life as we know it today, certainly. Without forests, life would be totally different. Think that more or less 50% of the rainfall in most continents comes through the evapotranspiration of the trees that form our forest. So 50% of the rainfall in many of the continents come directly from our forests, because they are like biotic pumps, and they help to bring the water from the oceans. They recirculate water from the oceans to the inland. And this is why when there is big deforestation close to the oceans, then desertification can accelerate, because you are breaking the cycle, this continuity of transporting the water into the inland. So water depends on our forest, and therefore food depends on our forest, because without water, it's very challenging to grow food.
In many of the indigenous traditions that I've encountered, the concept that water is the lifeblood, and the connections of water around the world is the lifeblood of how we all operate, is a really key concept. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, totally. And again, forests are a crucial infrastructure to circulate that water, in the atmosphere, but also underground. Because forests, through the root systems, they help to modify the soil so that water infiltrates in the right way, so that it reaches other plants and other parts of the landscape. So they are the big pumps of our planet to transform water in the atmosphere. They are called the blue rivers, but also underground. So at the end of the day, forests are our regulating infrastructures for oxygen, for water, for climate, because they are also the main absorption for CO2.
I had the pleasure of meeting some experts in forest experiences, let's say, who'd looked at the science around forests and the sorts of chemicals that are released when a person is in a forest. But if we were to take that up to a global level, Marc, where are we now with forest preservation, I understand that it's becoming actually quite difficult to preserve the remaining forest that we have. But not only that, that even if we did restore forests with modern day practices, even then, actually what's important is preserving those ancient forests that have been here for thousands of years. What's your perspective?
Yeah, nowadays we have around 35% of our land is covered by forest. But from those forests, probably around 25% of those forests are considered primary forest, what you call the ancient forest, which are of huge value in terms of biodiversity, carbon storage, and also huge value because there are millions of indigenous people living within those forests. So they have a very important cultural, historical value. So we need to really preserve those forests. And of course, we need to expand the forest surface globally in many parts of the world, because as I mentioned before, they play an incredible role as a terrestrial carbon sink, as a water pump, as a planetary water pump below and above ground. They are also the main terrestrial host of biodiversity. As I mentioned before, biodiversity is the true engine of life and therefore of any economic activity. So forests are the true engines of our economy, directly and indirectly, and you can build a forest economy using sustainably many of the resources that forests provide. If you treat forests well and you invest in biodiversity-friendly forest management practices. Nowadays, technology is available to transform wood in almost any type of solutions to replace petrochemicals. You can create bioplastics. You can create wood engineering products to replace concrete and steel. You can even replace some rare earth. For example, components of electric batteries can be replaced by wood-based solutions. So, and this could become a really interesting business opportunity to provide incentives to restore more forests, to manage them sustainably, to generate economic business opportunities to replace fossil-based alternatives.
So perhaps if we focus on that now, we've talked a little bit about your past. Now let's talk about today and the future. You're currently engaged with the Circular Bioeconomy Alliance and building that. Will you tell us a bit about its aims?
Yes. So the Circular Bioeconomy Alliance was established by His Majesty the King a few years ago. It's a UK-based charity. But basically, our ambition is we are very action-oriented. Our ambition is to demonstrate on the ground through projects that we call living labs, the benefits of transitioning from an extractive fossil-based economy that develops at the expense of nature, climate, and our own health towards a circular bioeconomy that is rooted in regenerative landscapes, that is powered by biodiversity, that is anchored in resilient communities, and that functions by creating circular bioeconomy production and consumption systems, basically systems that operate within the planetary boundaries. And we do that by demonstrating and executing specific projects that are iconic for different industries and in different landscapes. I give you an example. One of our most successful living labs has been sponsored by Giorgio Armani. And in that project, what we have been doing in the south of Italy, in Puglia, is to demonstrate how you can produce cotton, which is the most important biological fiber used by the fashion industry, how you can produce cotton in a regenerative way, producing cotton by restoring biodiversity, by sequestering carbon, using biological inputs and trees as part of the systems where you are producing cotton, rather than using extractive monoculture approaches, fossil inputs in the form of fertilizers or pesticides. And now the project, after 3 years, have demonstrated that it is a very successful way to produce cotton. Giorgio Armani is selling now the first 2,000 to 3,000 t-shirts with the cotton that was produced in this living lab. These t-shirts are selling better than the conventional ones. They have a digital passport so that people can see the full traceability, which is very important, how this cotton was produced, but the sequence through the value chain, so that people can have full traceability and transparency. And now we are working in the same with the same approaches in coffee, in cocoa, in other agricultural products. But the idea is to show that this transition is not only possible, but it creates better business opportunities. So we are developing this blueprint so that then we can scale them up.
And when you're working with businesses, what is attracting them to explore these ideas, these new projects with you?
I think, first of all, we have a strong scientific background. We have a network of scientists and scientific organizations working with us. I think now is a good moment to work with many corporates because they are realizing more and more that we have entered into a new normal. They are realizing the challenges that they face in their supply chains. In the case of cotton, price volatility, and geopolitical challenges. So many corporates are trying to bring closer and closer and rediscover their supply chains, bring them under their control. And I think they are seeing more and more arguments to move towards regenerative, nature-based solutions in order to build resilience, because they realize that in the current world and the world that is emerging, where there will be more frequent and intense climate-related shocks, resilience is going to be key for any business to operate.
100%. As we're talking, Marc, it strikes me, having done all your work in forestry as a scientist and really loving that work, you genuinely love nature and forests specifically. What made you decide that you're going to leave that life as an academic and really translate that into a very, very applied and pretty cutthroat, ruthless, in many ways, highly commercial arena?
Good question. And also remember that I was living in Finland. So my house was by the lake in front of the forest. So that was quite an ideal life. Well, there are a few reasons why I decided to come to London and work for Lombard Odier. And well, the first reason was His Majesty the King. I mean, he's an extraordinary visionary leader. And, working with him is a privilege, is an honor. And I thought that we cannot miss this opportunity of having someone like him establishing the Circular Bioeconomy Alliance and providing his time, his leadership to make this happen. So I thought, okay, this is a life-changing opportunity that cannot be missed. Second also is that after working for 25 years in the world of science, I was very frustrated because you see, we were doing already scientific research 25 years ago, telling to politicians, estimating through models that the problem of wildfires will accelerate climate change impacts. So we had a lot of knowledge and nothing happened. So at the end, I thought, why to continue doing science if it is not translated to action or it takes so much time? So I said, okay, I think it's time to jump into the private sector, the finance sector, to try to connect the dots and translate all this science into real action, economic action. It's not easy, but this is why I decided to come here, to try to help finance people to understand the importance of nature and how to translate that understanding of nature into nature positive investment strategies. Not because they are nature positive and for philanthropic or altruism. No, because it's the only way to secure the future and the future resilience of our economy. So to try to make the point that, or we start understanding and investing in nature-based solutions, regenerative practices, or there will be no economy in the next 25, 50 years.
And do you think that the policymakers are listening? I remember the CBA event you hosted last year. There was a really profound focus on the interlinkage between our natural environment and public health, and how we as individuals are benefiting or not benefiting from access to biodiversity and nature in real terms, real monetary terms, what a health service is paying to support us as individuals when our health declines, for example, for environmental reasons. So yes, this linkage, do you think that?
Yeah, this is the frustration that we have so much knowledge and data available to argue for transforming our system. But of course, the inertia is so big. That we have an inertia of more than 150 years of this fossil-based economy. Oil is the true engine of our economy now, for energy, for materials, the plastics that we use, the inputs for our food, fertilizers, everything relies on this fossil economy. Now, paradoxically, we are not only seeing the problems of the impacts of using fossil resources, but also the problems of depending on fossil resources when there is a crisis like in the Middle East. So I think, to me, it shows that this system is already rotten. I think we are seeing the last, hopefully, 20 years. Of course, it's an inertia of 200 years. So transitions to new systems will take 2-3 decades. And I think public sector is trying to do its best, especially in Europe. There is a lot of regulation. The problem is that there are so many industries that have been doing things for the last 200 years in a certain way. And they have so many interests and so many investments have been flowing towards this that people feel trapped. Many people have interest and they don't want to change, as simple as that. And the ones that want to change feel trapped, or they don't have the leverage to do that. And this is why I also decided to join Lombard Odier, because I saw that they were very committed in trying to understand nature and making nature investable to transform our economy. So we need to start showing that this works and it delivers.
There are people who understand that change needs to happen, and then there's a systemic challenge, which is around actually transforming an infrastructure that needs to adapt, but will take time and money to do so. But perhaps in some of our closing thoughts, we could think about your perspectives on what does it take from individuals who are operating in these systems. How is that changing the development of these initiatives over time? Has the old way fallen by the wayside yet? What do we need to change inside ourselves, perhaps?
Yeah, I think, look, and again, nature changes you. So I think it's very important to reconnect to nature on a daily basis, to have your own routines, and really care about what really matters in life. And this is what I had the chance to spend a few weeks living with indigenous people in the middle of the Amazon. And for me, it was shocking and very inspiring to see how they start the day. First, a ceremony to interpret the dreams. Then they paint their faces, depending on what is the aim of the day. And that is a way for them to reflect, you could say meditate, about your purpose in your life, and then translate that into the goals of the day. But, 1/3 of the day is a time for reflection, to be with others, reflect, and then you act. Here in our world, many times you have the feeling that you are like running like a chicken without a head, it's like everything goes very fast. Sometimes we don't reflect about what we are really doing. What do we aim at? And then we run out of time and we wonder what we have achieved. So we need more time to reflect. Nature can inspire us because then you follow the rhythms of nature. So we need to adjust our own personal rhythms, our economic rhythms, our societal rhythms to the rhythms of nature, basically because nature is what defines our planet, and we live in this planet. We don't live in another planet. So this synchronicity between us and nature, which requires understanding that nature does not belong to us, we belong to nature. And this is something that we need to keep remembering.
This idea of reconnection and custodianship is an interesting one. We aren't consumers, but we are custodians and we're citizens. Perhaps that's something we might reflect on.
And this is, you touch a very important point, that is the world we have created, the economic system, which is a system addicted to fossil resources and to consumption at all cost, treat us not as citizens, but as consumers. And I think we need to grow up, after these 150 years, which are the teenage years of a new industrial system that we have created. And I think we need to grow up and become citizens after being consumers for the last 100 years, and grow up and become citizens, which means reconnecting to nature. I think we need, in many senses, a new renaissance. We had the Black Death at the end of the Middle Ages, then the Renaissance came. It was a very inspiring moment where science and art were the same thing. You had people like Leonardo da Vinci, scientists working with mathematicians like Luca de Pacioli. They reinvented art. They reinvented the lenses with what we interpret and look at the world. Then we enter, after that, into the scientific revolution. We started becoming more mechanistic, more Cartesian, reducing the world into parts, and trying to understand the world as a machine. And then we enter into the industrial era, the industrial revolution, and everything accelerated. We develop a mindset of mining and seeing nature as a resource rather than as an infrastructure. And we have translated this approach of mining to everything we do. We extract, we use, we waste. And this is now where we have been out of the planetary boundaries. So there is, a need to rethink our paradigm, the way we relate to nature, and develop an economy that prospers in harmony with it.
Marc, if you were to say to our listeners, if they have a desire to reconnect with their mission and their purpose, and it's somewhere related to nature, how would you advise that they could start that reconnection or that identification of what is my mission and purpose in relation to this?
Take time and spend time in nature. I think most of us have the possibility, even in living in big cities, to find places that are 1 hour or, some distance to spend time, weekends, but really reconnect on daily basis if you can, and find time to let things go, to reflect, and, you will find your inspiration and your way. But you need to stop doing the things that you do that. You will not get different results if you keep doing the same things, So you need to break these inertias. And I think if you want to do something related to nature, first of all, you need to understand nature, spend time in nature. And it's very intuitive. You don't need to be a scientist to understand nature. It's very intuitive, just spending time listening, observing, but having enough time to relax and seeing the cycles, how things work, breathe, you will feel better. I think it's spending this time and being disciplined in spending time and reflecting, time to think also. It's very important to think. Devoting every day some time to thinking.
What this makes me reflect on myself is we are constantly bombarded with our devices, our emails, our phones, which are there to distract us. And if we have a spare moment, it's very compelling to just scroll, to look, to check constantly a message, which itself has a physiological effect on ourselves. And so the discipline of saying, well, actually, for the next 5, 10, 30 minutes, actually, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to choose something different. Perhaps that's one way of starting to change a pattern. And it's really hard to break the habit, but
it's what I do. I decided, I think 10 years ago, more or less, I decided that every morning, my first 2 hours, I will be connected to nature and reading, because for me, reading is very important because it helps me to think and to reflect. Sometimes I read in 45 minutes, 2 pages only, because I use that to reflect. But the first 2 hours every day, I don't check mobile, so the mobile phone is somewhere else, because I don't want that that machine conditions my day. So I start every day, the first 2 hours, no devices, it's me, a book, and I have a little garden, so I am in my garden. Sometimes just watching at the flower and reading, but just let things go and reflect and think and have a coffee. But then I think this is very important because it shapes my day. I start my day controlling who I am and my agenda. No one else is controlling my agenda, and I set the basis of the day. And then you start action, and of course, there are very intense days, but at least it works for me. The first 2 hours, I am in control. No mobile phones, no something and I am alone. So I wake up very early so that I can find this moment of peace. But for me, it works at least.
And for many, many ancient traditions, it has worked also. Marc, if people want to learn more about the Circular Bioeconomy Alliance, where can they find out?
In our website, they will find out, circularbioeconomyalliance.org, and they will find all the information there.
Perfect. We'll make sure that that's linked in the show notes. Marc, is there anything else you'd like to share with our listeners so that they can also be a force for nature within wherever they're sitting in an organization?
Well, I think we are living in extraordinary times. Was it Lenin that said that there are decades where nothing happened and years where decades happen? And I think we are in one of these historical moments now, meaning the next 10, 15, 20 years, which are going to define the next 200-300 years. And I think it's important to be conscious about that. Every 200-300 years, there are 2 decades that shape what is coming afterwards. Look, in the 70s, 76, independence of America, it was the Wealth of Nations publication by Adam Smith. It was the discovery of the steam engine by James Watt that put the basis for the Industrial Revolution, democracy as we know it today, the capitalism, so it shaped. Now we are in another moment. We don't know what will happen, but I think we need to all join forces to ensure that the next 200 years will go in the right direction.
Mm. Marc, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.
Thank you for listening to Wild by Nature. If today's conversation sparked reflection, grounded you, or reminded you of what matters, take a moment to stay connected. Follow Wild by Nature on Apple Podcasts, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts, and join me as we continue exploring what it means to live in relationship with the earth and with each other. We'll see you next time.
Resonate.